Ikra is president of the University of Leicester International Relations Society, and today she will be presenting on the Syrian conflict, and in particular she will be focusing on the refugee situation in Syria at the moment and displacement of persons. So I present Ikra.
Refugee is to really provide people with information, with awareness about the reality of refugee experiences and asylum seekers in the UK. And it also celebrates the contributions that refugees have made in the UK as well. At Refugee Week, what we want to do really is to promote a better understanding of why people seek sanctuary, why do people have to come to seek refuge, and we'll also be fundraising for City of Sanctuary, who are a local Leicester charity, and they provide practical support for refugees in the UK. Today, my presentation is on the conflict in Syria and how this conflict is affecting the refugees and the refugee experience. Just a quick overview of my presentation. I'll be looking at the background, the context as to why the conflict happened and why in particular we focus on Syria. In part 2 I'll be discussing the refugee experience, where the refugees have come from, where they're going and how they're being treated at refugee camps. And part 3 will look at gender, ethnicity and religion and how that affects the refugee experience. Before we start talking about the main focus, which is refugees and you know, how that's come about from the Syrian conflict, we need to contextualise what's happened in Syria. And you know, we've heard the term the Arab Spring being thrown around and branded around in different, you know, news reports and things like that. But what do we mean by the Arab Spring? Well, what we're focused on really is a mass movement. It's a revolutionary movement which aims to bring about change in countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Whose revolution are we talking about? In Syria, we're talking about the youth. Many of the protesters are in their 20s or 30s. Initially, the protesters called for political reform, but now that's grown for the removal of the Assad regime. And really, it's a movement towards a better life, more freedoms for all. In Syria, we have to really think about why the conflict happened, and one of the main aspects is corruption, and in particular the corruption of the Syrian government under President Assad. At first it would seem that Syria would follow the rest of the countries that experienced the Arab Spring, you know, such as Egypt and Tunisia, who seem to get rid of their dictators with some ease, arguably. But President Assad's refusal to let go of power in Syria is causing a messy and bloody conflict. What people are protesting against is the concentration and abuse of power by the Assad family and his political party. President Assad has held the presidency for 4 decades, and he's made the system very difficult in that he's put top elites in key positions in the Syrian government, which is proving to be more difficult to dismantle. Economic problems as well, insecurity, poverty. It's estimated that 800,000 Syrians lived in deep poverty, and 32% of Syrians are now living on less than $2 a day. So these are the kind of reasons, you know, why we have to contextualise what's happened, and these are the kind of reasons that have pushed people to protest in Syria. In relation to Refugee Week and what we're focusing on, we have to look at the significance of the conflict in Syria. It's political and it's social. Political in the sense that you have sort of a war between rebel forces who are arguably seeking freedom, emancipation, and between the government as well that's trying to hold on to power. And this has massive social consequences, and we'll talk about this later as well, the consequences that it has on the Syrian population and internally displaced people. Just a quick note as well why we chose to focus on Syria in particular. The Arab Spring has brought about many changes, and each country that has undergone this experience it's too complex to put it in. It's too complex basically to pick out to say that Arab Spring is one mass movement. We have to contextualise, and with Syria, the main issue that we chose to focus on is the issue of refugees and how the violence in Syria is causing this mass movement of refugees. Which parts of Syria are being affected? This is a report from September to November 2012, and it shows all the violent affected areas. So these are areas throughout Syria that have been affected by violent conflict, usually between the rebel forces and the government. We've got another diagram here, and this shows the number of internally displaced people within Syria. And you can see in Damascus it's quite high, 200,000, almost 250,000, in Homs as well, and Aleppo. By internally displaced people, what we mean is someone who is forced to flee their home within the country of their borders. They're often referred to as refugees, although they don't really fall within the current legal definition of a refugee. In order to understand why people are seeking refuge in other countries, we have to look at the violence in Syria, and this is quite significant for the case of Syria because the violence has been particularly messy. We've got the example of a town outside Damascus in 2012, and it was described as a gruesome massacre. Over 400 people died, and what it did was it pushed citizens to seek safety away from their homes, and now Damascus is one of the largest areas for internally displaced Syrians. It's estimated that around 2.5 million people to 4 million people are internally displaced, but most of them are held in local communities within Syria, families, external family, that kind of thing. And to really understand why people are being pushed to these measures, you can use the example of Battleground Towns. Battleground Towns is something used to describe an area which has been affected by conflict, and I'll just show a quick video of the kind of things that Syrians are facing in these battleground towns. We see the kind of conditions that people are facing in their hometowns, and that's really an explanation as to why people are migrating out of Syria. One of the places that's experiencing a high number of Syrian refugees is Jordan. It's estimated that around 150,000 registered refugees, but there are about 53,000 still waiting to be registered. And this refugee population is expected to grow by 10,000 per week. And one of the significant things about the Jordanian refugee camps is that they quite often suffer from very poor conditions. And this is because the Jordanian economy can't really afford to pump the resources that it needs to into these refugee camps. You know, we've got an official saying here that we've run out of space to house these people, and it's actually forcing many people to return back to Syria. I've got a video here of I think one of the camps in Jordan. So that was one of the refugee camps in Jordan, and if we just go back to this map, most of the Syrian refugees in Jordan are coming from the south, so in the area, you know, Damascus and Daraa, where there's been high numbers of violent casualties, so that's where they're coming from. As I said before, the thing with Jordan is that the economy of Jordan is not as strong as Turkey, for example, that are also holding refugees, and so many refugees are suffering from poor conditions. You know, the dust whipped up by the wind in the desert as well, it's causing a lot of respiratory diseases. There's 1 lantern per 50 refugees, and refugees are not allowed to leave these camps without special permits. Most of the women and children are smuggled under protection of rebels, and then they get smuggled into Jordan, and there are hundreds of thousands of families coming into the cities. There is reduced access to food staples, and the UN has documented that it's having grave impacts on women and children's health in these provinces. The other refugee camp that's quite big as well is Turkey, and if we go back here, a lot of the refugees in Turkey are coming from the north, so Aleppo, which also has a high number of violent conflicts between rebel forces and the government, and it's estimated around 150,000 refugees are there. The problem with Turkey is that it often faces overcrowded conditions. It does have the resources, more so than Jordan and Lebanon, to provide these refugees with the facilities that they need, but there is a lot of overcrowdedness. The Turkish authorities have said that there's simply no space left in these refugee camps. One of the more almost positive aspects of this experience has been the aspect of community that refugees have put across. In Turkey, for example, they've opened schools and they've opened markets as well in their refugee camps. We've got Mustafa Shakir here, who opened a school in a Turkish refugee camp, and his aim is simply to teach the children that are there that have suffered from that conflict. This is really the main focus of the Refugee Week this year, and it's on gender, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, and how these really affect the refugee experience. One of the main worries is the role of women, especially women refugees, and the use of women as weapons of war. Now, when we say things like that, what we're talking about really is women used as for exploitation, especially sexual exploitation, and it's cited that many women and girls have actually fled Syria because of the sexual violence they faced in their home country. Not only are they facing sexual exploitation in their own country, but also in refugee camps. There was a UN assessment, I think a few months ago, and an international rescue committee estimated that a large number of women are experiencing sexual exploitation in Egypt, and also they're being forced into marriages and things like that just to provide for their children and for themselves. Also, 3/4 of Syrian refugees are actually women, so you can really see how important it is to make these problems, to make these problems sort of aware to people as well. 3/4 of women, that's a large amount, that's 75%, and these women are facing exploitation not only in their own countries but in the refugee camps as well. Also, we're looking at ethnicity and religion and how that really affects the refugee experience. In terms of ethnicity, there are many Palestinians in Syria, and these are called the Palestinians of Syria, and they're actually going to refugee camps in Jordan. But because there is an already high population of Palestinians within Jordan from previous years, I think there is about almost 2 million Palestinians in Jordan already. Palestinian refugees are often neglected, and also there's coordination between Jordanian forces and the Free Syrian Army to prevent any Palestinians from actually crossing into Jordan to get to these refugee camps. Also, we have Muslim refugees from Syria who are crossing into Christian areas of Lebanon. Obviously, this is causing tension in Lebanon itself. It's been reported that Muslim aid agencies have discriminated Christian Syrian refugees, and obviously the relationship between Hezbollah, an organisation in Lebanon, and Assad was a positive relationship. So that's also causing tension in Lebanon as well, which is receiving a high number of refugees. So it's from these points that you can really see how political belief, how religion, how gender plays a role in the refugee experience, and that's really what we wanted to focus on for this event anyway. So now I guess it's just if anyone wants to ask any questions, or we can open the floor up for debate, then we can do.
Just say on the issue of women, there was a report on Sunday about women in Turkey being sold to Arabs.
Yeah, definitely. As I said before, like a lot of them are being forced to kind of see, they're being pushed to this measure. They don't have any other choice. They've left their husbands in Syria for obviously if they want to stay there and fight, or they want to protect their livestock, then they've had to leave with their children, and they have no other option but to do that. And this is why we wanted to focus on women, especially this Refugee Week, because for them, gender plays such an important role.
Is there any involvement from international aid agencies?
Yeah, there has been, especially the United Nations. They've helped as much as they can, but obviously, the political aspects of the conflict are really overweighing that, especially political interest in regards to China and Russia and America as well. So that's really putting a strain on how much humanitarian aid we can really give out to Syria and refugee camps. Yeah.
What's the like the political or ideological composition of the Free Syrian Army?
I think initially it was one that we've seen, across many Arab nations that have gone through the Arab Spring. It was about freedom, it was about getting political rights. But obviously, with the conflict in Syria, it's becoming increasingly messy. Not only because of the different ethnicities in Syria, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have different sects of Syrians, different ethnicities of Syrians. I think that's complicating the rebel movement a lot. I think it's becoming more difficult to distinguish between the freedom fighters, so to speak, and the people that are the so-called terrorists that the Assad regime is talking about.
I'll say something about the Kurdish situation.
Yeah.
There are loads of politics here, aren't there? Really?
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
in terms of the Kurds who are in the northern area along the border with Turkey, the Kurds haven't joined the Free Syrian Army as such. They've had demonstrations against the government, but they've not joined the Free Syrian Army because they've not been assured that the Free Syrian Army solution would include them in a way that they feel would give them their human rights, and that the Free Syrian Army's been supported by Turkey. But there's another force in there, which is Jabhat al-Nusra and these other jihadist groups, which are making things very, very complicated, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think some Free Syrian Army people will say that Jabhat al-Nusra is doing a good job because actually they're suicide bombing and they're very effective in terms of using weapons. But other Free Syrian Army people will say we don't want them because what they will bring is not what we want either. So you've got some people who are not joining with the Free Syrian Army campaigns because they don't feel that that's going to bring a resolution. The Christians, I think, are part of that group. Christians used to be quite privileged, I think, in Syria, and they're not feeling that the Muslim solution will respect them, as it hasn't in Iraq, for example. The Druze, I think, are in that group as well. But the addition of Jabhat al-Nusra has been very interesting because America's prescribed them as a terrorist organisation. And you've got groups that want a solution using weapons, and the coalition is actually calling for weapons to be provided. And you've got other people who want a non-violent solution who don't have much of a voice. And the Kurds have decided to stay out of that because they've managed to organise their own area so that there is relative peace in that area, but they are being attacked by the regime and some Free Syrian Army people and Jabhat al-Nusra as well. And on the international scale, I could talk forever about this, but I'll stop in a minute. There seems to be a number of conflicts going on. One is the Sunni Muslim versus the Shia. So the Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar would like to cut the Lebanon, Iran, Syria line. The Al-Assad family isn't exactly Shia, but it's the line to that. And then you've got Israel in there. You've also got Turkey's problem with its Kurdish population. You've got America and Russia both wanting control over that piece of land and neither wanting the other to get any power. You've got China wanting to do trade in there as well. It's just really messy, and the United Nations isn't getting it together because all those countries won't think about what's right for the Syrian people, they're just thinking about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what makes Syria so different as well from Egypt as well. It's just so messy, and there's so much politics behind it.
And then you've got the international jihadists who, it seems, are seeing this as a place where, what I'm hearing is that Al-Qaeda is very active with these groups, and Al-Qaeda is wondering whether Syria could be a place for itself. So they're wanting to take over, and they're very different from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is very different from other brands of Islam.
You talked about the
the large numbers that are internally displaced.
Yeah.
And you've talked about the refugees that are in other countries in camps.
Yes.
And I mean, obviously they've been there for a while now. What kind of timescales are our world leaders thinking that they're going to stay in those camps?
At the refugee camps. I think that, well, for one, I know that there's a big debate about how much time you should put on countries that are undergoing this kind of process. You know, where do you say, okay, they've had a revolution, and how long does it take for stability to occur? And that's really what the debate is about. Like, how long can you say enough is enough? And I think in particular with refugees, because it's a humanitarian issue, they want to get that, you know, fixed as soon as possible. But they don't realise that it's actually being affected by the political aspect of it as well. So it, you know, in answer to your question, it's impossible to tell really. You know, I don't think anybody could put a number on something like that.
And are there any local organisations that are sending aid out?
In Leicester?
Yeah, I mean...
yeah, they're probably... I know that there is a few Muslim charities that are actually doing that. Islamic Relief, for example, they're quite big in Leicester. Yeah. I know they're doing that. You know, and obviously Refugee Action as well, I'm sure they'll be doing something with Syria as well. But yeah, you know, definitely fundraising. We did. There was an event at the university a few months ago actually. I think there was a cake sale for Syria. Was that Islamic Society?
Yeah, it was
Islamic Society. So they're quite big on that as well. Yeah.
Have you any Syrian students on campus, and are they being given respite from their fees?
Yeah, we do actually. We do have, I think, was it two Syrian students on campus. The student uni is actually trying to get in contact with them and seeing if there's anything that we can do to help them, and the International Relations Society as well. And we're trying to contact them and see what their situation is and if there's anything that we can do to help.
There's a campaign about students, isn't there? There's
there is. Yeah, that's part of the
620 students in England or something like that who have not got their fees paid for them anymore, and who are suffering quite a lot of hardship. And the universities are expected by the government to sort out their fees, but the hardship bit is really, really hard. When Libya was in conflict, the government paid the fees for the students and gave the students an allowance, but that's not happening. So if you go to Avaz, AVAAZ, there's a campaign running on there to get the government to do something.
How is England treating, for example, refugees that are coming from Syria, if they actually manage to get to England?
I think a large number I think it's a very, very small percentage of refugees that are actually getting here, but most of them are probably, you know, professionals. But in terms of their treatment, you know, if any of you came to the event yesterday, we talked in particular the legal aspects surrounding how refugees you know, come into the United Kingdom and how they assimilate into British society, and you know, talking about it's actually quite a difficult process. We had Bushra Ali, who's a legal practitioner at a local Leicester law firm, and she was talking about, you know, just the massive human errors that happen in this process. You know, misunderstandings, misinterpretation of documents, not being given the right interpreter, not speaking the right dialect, you know, gender issues as well. So, you know, the actual refugee process itself is a difficult one. So, but on the actual number of Syrians that come to the UK, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing it's a very small percentage.
What kind of things do you think the international community and nations could be doing in order to help refugees in Syria?
I think that personally, I think that charity is the short-term solution, you know, fundraising and things like that. But I think the international community really needs to focus on the political aspect of it, because as soon as you sort the politics out, it's then that you can start implementing proper policies or, you know, proper humanitarian relief, you know, which will actually get to these people. There is aid coming in, but countries are just not able to cope with the level of refugees that are coming in.
But do you think in the short term, regarding refugees, do you think it's a country's responsibility to take in refugees from Syria, and this isn't just Syria. This could be from any country that has political, military turmoil. But do you think it is a responsibility of more powerful nations like the UK, the United States, pretty much anything in the EU? Is it their responsibility to take these people in, or do you believe it to be more of a domestic issue?
Well, this is a very personal view, but I think that where do we want society to go? That's the big question. Like, do we want states to be responsible for their own people and kind of like leave it as if it's not a problem, or do we want to kind of move towards a more like globalized, more international based community? And I think that by making countries responsible, that's where you're heading. And I think that sort of especially with in terms of Jordan and Turkey, they're putting pressure on the Syrian government to sort the problem out because they're facing such high numbers of refugees. So I think that in the long term, if that's what this is the kind of international community we want, then we should be putting responsibility on countries.
Yeah, I do tend to think we can choose who we're going to welcome in. And I remember in 1998 when large amounts of Kosovans arrived by the plane load and were accommodated in what used to be the International Hotel, which is in the centre of town. And yes, there were lots of rooms there, and lots of people gave them lots of clothing things, and food was provided. And if governments want to do it, if they have the political will to help people out, they can. But if we don't put enough pressure on our governments, then obviously it's much easier for them to pretend it's not really a problem.
Can the West actually get involved in that particular region without it looking slightly colonial, as in the Italians couldn't actually directly intervene in Libya without it being seen as like a repeat of like the 1940s? So could the West actually have a reason to actually go without the international community condemning them for neo-colonialism?
That's definitely something which is an important issue in regards to the Arab Spring, especially with Libya as well. There's this whole debate surrounding, is Western intervention just neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, as you said. And I think that humanitarian intervention is in itself a different issue from the refugee experience. But with regards to that, I don't think that intervention would be something that is a viable option, simply because of what we were talking about earlier, just the complexity of the situation. With Libya, for example, it was clear that there was people that wanted freedom and people that wanted the old regime. But in Syria, it's not that clear. It's not so clear what people want, and it's not so clear who those people are. And if we intervene, then we don't know what kind of government we're going to get. We don't know if there's going to be a secular government or an Islamic government. And if there is an Islamic government, then obviously that has big implications for Syria's relation with its neighbours as well. So I think humanitarian intervention at this point is a definite no. Would you say that as well?
I would just generally leave the situation as it is and just let it just play out as it should, rather than getting like Western military hardware in there, which would then provide an even more bigger problem later down the line when if they do remove the Assad government. There's a lot of guns out here, and then it will basically degenerate into endless bloody civil war for 20 odd years.
Definitely,
I'll just say something about the British government position at the minute. The British government's worried about the chemical weapons that are in Syria, and they certainly don't want certain groups to get their hands on them. So they are intervening. They supported the Syrian National Council, which was a group that was formed by Turkey, because I think they saw them as being fairly, not moderate, but fairly moderate Islamic group that would be also supported by Turkey, would keep Turkey happy in that area, maybe would be under control. But that didn't work, and now there's the Syrian National Coalition, And so it's now pushing the Syrian National Coalition to belong to this Friends of Syria group, and they're taking them round to meet different people. They're promising them aid. Now, we don't have to give them weapons. We give them hardware that enables them to use the weapons effectively, but the weapons are going in from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. We know that. That's happening anyway. But unfortunately, the Syrian National Coalition isn't a very strong organisation, and nor is it accepted by the people on the ground in Syria. But nevertheless, it is our champion. And our British government, I hate this, but this is what's happening. Our British government is pushing that for all it's worth, along with America and various other groups, because they feel that that way they can get the Syrian National Coalition to maybe have some power in the coming Syria, and then they'll have a foothold in there. So while it's not obvious, we are very involved in what's going on there, and we're part of this not sorting it out group at the UN. If we push communications, things could be so much better.
Another country even more concerned about chemical weapons in Syria, whether they're made up, of course, is Israel. And their position presumably is, well, what we are now certain by the rest of us, because the relations between them and the Syrian regime in the past have not been friendly, but at least they've been quiet. Except indirectly there's been conflict, because Syria's been supporting Hezbollah, who haven't been nearly so quiet. But still, probably Israel prefers some sort of stability, whatever it might be, in Syria, rather than chaos. They probably don't know what to do to achieve that, but they'll probably take any chance they see coming up that suits them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Israel as well. Just, so much to say, so many different factors playing into that, and to go into if we were to intervene, the consequences would be severe. There's so many different ties between different countries. It'd be so difficult to ensure stability in that region, especially the tension between Israel and Iran as well.
These talks that the leader of the Syrian National Coalition went out on his own and said, "I'll talk to anyone." The coalition have pulled him back, unfortunately. But that is the way, in my view, that's the way forward, is for people to get engaged in those debates and those discussions with each other and break down the barriers that are there. Russia and America were saying that people are doing a lot of talking and not walking, aren't they? But there is a potential there. The guns just isn't going to make it any better for anybody. But it is going to go on for a long time, that's the prediction. So the Syrian refugees are just going to be languishing in squalor.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the thing with the coalition as well. It's so weak, and it's happened in so many of these countries as well. These countries have faced, political opposition has faced suppression for years, and they've not been able to grow in that sense, in the democratic sense. And so now you have these weak coalitions that just won't offer the same stability, and it's the same with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as well, and in Libya.
There is some talk that Bashar al-Assad might see this out. He'd be weak, but actually he might stay there for quite a long time to come.
And what about refugees? I mean, we talked a lot about women and gender and religion as well, and how that plays into it. Is there anyone from City of Sanctuary today? Yes.
Earlier you said that about 3/4 of the refugees are women. Why do you think it's like that? Why is it like that?
Why are there more women?
Why are more women being displaced?
Like I said before, a lot of women are, leaving their husbands because their husbands have chosen to stay. Brothers, fathers, husbands, they've chosen to stay and, try and protect their homes, or to join either government forces or to join the Free Syria Army. And so women are being, forced to leave with their children, to leave their husbands back in Syria. And that's why you've got 75% of the refugee population women. Yeah.
I don't know, I've heard at least from people that I know that has family in Syria, that the men are going over the border to Lebanon, because if they get caught, either side. Either they will be forced to join either side. Like the government army would want them to fight for them, or the other side would want them to fight. So it's actually what I've heard is like they leave the wives and the children back in home in Syria, and then they escape to neighboring countries, Jordan or Lebanon. And what's happening with the women and children is like different they like organize for them to be smuggled out of Syria, because Syria is not actually allowing people to cross the border. So that's what I've heard, at least that's the reason.
Yeah, maybe
I've heard the other way around.
Yeah, definitely, probably.
Because I know a couple of families that they've been left with, like, for example, like a wife and her children, her husband leave because he's of good age, he has to leave, and they leave it with like her parents, in-laws or something, and then later on they have to seek refugee somehow.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like that. I guess we're just focusing on particular areas, but I'm sure it's probably not the same in every area. I'm sure there are probably more men in some refugee camps than there are women. But yeah, I mean, there's almost, what is it, 500,000 refugees now in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. So I guess getting that kind of information is always difficult.
Yeah, no, I think I guess it's easier to get women out of Syria than men, and that's why. And once they get them out, they're not as visible. Yeah, because otherwise, for example, if the Free Syrian Army, what is it called? The Free Syrian Army is helping to smuggle out women and children, they would be like, where's the men? We kind of want them to fight with us, and if the men don't want to fight, they kind of, I think they seek refuge on their own. Maybe that's what it is.
What was the treatment of homosexuals before the revolution and now during it?
In Syria?
Yeah, in Syria.
Well, obviously, during the Assad regime it was secular, but I'm not actually sure, 100% sure what, maybe you could tell us what were homosexuals treated like under Assad.
I'm asking because I have absolutely no idea.
Well, I'm not sure, does anybody?
I think my understanding is that most Syrians would say we don't have homosexuals here. I don't know if it was against the law, but while it was a secular government, there was quite a lot of the elements of Islam in there, which wasn't accepting of homosexuality. So I think if you were gay, you'd probably keep it very quiet.
Well, in general, in the Middle East, there are like gay communities, but most of them are kept quite underground. And there is like inherent kind of like homophobia and that's just part of the society. And I guess there's still a lot of patriarchy as well. But I mean, even straight men who will dress in a gay way are kind of vilified socially and stuff like that. So if there's any homosexuals, like male and female, they're usually in an underground community. And most of them do have like online communities and stuff, message boards and stuff like that. So, yeah.
I don't think it was like Iran, where Ahmadinejad will say you've chosen to be homosexual, therefore you've chosen to go against Allah and you can be killed. It's not like that.
Yeah, I think most of them, like usually in the Shami countries, so like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, they will acknowledge that there are gay people or whatever, but they're just hassled more in society and stuff, so I don't know.
I was also wondering, I think I saw a report for 2011 or 2010, the countries that host the most refugees, and Syria was number 3 because of all the Iraqi refugees that came in.
Yeah.
So what happens to them now, and what happens to those refugees?
Yeah, it's quite similar with the, you might be able to remind us as well, with the Palestinian refugees as well. Like they're being treated badly in Jordan because there are so many Palestinians there anyway, and very often they refuse entry into these countries as well. So with Iraqi refugees in Syria, it's probably a very similar situation that they're facing as well, and that opens questions about the broader political aspect as well. Kind of these conflicts spilling over into different countries.
To follow up on the question, Do you feel that the increased influx of refugees into Syria over the past 4 to 5 years has contributed to the destabilization of Assad's regime?
I know, like, internally, economically, from like the people I've spoke with who do not support the Free Syrian Army were saying that like this is just going to lead Syria to economic ruins, because one thing that I guess his regime did do was stabilize Syria economically and kind of fix tourism and market Syria, especially Damascus, as like a cultural hub of the Middle East, and his like lots of history and architecture and stuff like that. So yeah. I don't know, but to be honest, like personally I don't know, but that's what other people have been saying.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the impact of refugees in Syria. That's what has happened.
Yeah, and the infrastructure too. Like if you look at the pictures, any photographer that goes, it's just like.
Yeah.
The other thing about Syria is that the American government went to the Syrian government for advice about torture for its rendition program, because they were excellent. And they kept a real lid on Syria for such a long time. I think it was a secret society, really. So whilst some of it flourished, for some people it was a really not a nice place to be. And the Muslim Brotherhood were actually banned from Syria. I don't know if you know, but in the 1980s, I can't remember exactly the year, but a lot of people in Hama were killed, 32,000, something like that. And the Muslim Brotherhood became an illegal organisation, as were the Kurdish organisations. But the Muslim Brotherhood went underground, and one of the things that I've been hearing is that the Muslim Brotherhood were very excited by the Arab Spring, and there was a bit of preparation happened in Syria. It's sudden demonstrations in Dara, because the children wrote on the wall, didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a hope. So I think they've come in with their brand of organisation, but most of the people in Syria didn't know about politics because they weren't allowed to. Very naive community and very easily swept in another direction.
But weren't the Muslim Brotherhood also banned in like Egypt as well and places like that, because it went against like official state policy?
Well, they're now ruling, aren't they, in Egypt and Libya? I think they're very well organised and they're very political. So they've had an upsurge in their power in that area.
Well, I know in Egypt at least, like, the problem when you prop up a secular dictatorship, like the Mubarak dictatorship was supported by the West for a long time because they were afraid of the rise of any Islamic movements or parties. So the Muslim Brotherhood was banned, any religious parties were banned, and they were not even allowed to form a party at all. So the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt made a name for themselves because during Mubarak's time, when they were banned, they actually did form, like, they were more of a social organization, and they provided help for people who couldn't put their kids through school, like kind of doing social worky stuff, but they didn't have an official party. So people become disillusioned with secularism and nationalism, and then you see that going on around the Middle East. So it's frustrating because it's kind of like a vicious circle, right?
So secularism and nationalism.
Yeah, and then like political, religious parties as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see as well what the outcome of Syria will be. Will it remain secular, or will it become jihadist or fundamentalist or Islamic?
You talked a bit, Sheila, about the Saudis and Kuwait and Qatar, and they're sending weapons in. Now, they're Shia?
No, they're Sunni.
They're Sunni. Their interest is to support
Muslim Brotherhood sort of outcomes, what they want to, not jihadist, but the Muslim Brotherhood sort of solution, certainly Sunni. And they've got lots of money, they're ploughing loads of money in
They
there.
do have lots of money, don't they?
Yeah, lots of weapons.
Lots of weapons.
And the secular people who were involved in the beginning, because the first 6 months was just peaceful demonstrations, and people going out in the streets with bottles of water and roses and giving them to the soldiers, and it was fantastic what was going on, although they were being killed, maybe 26 a day, but now we're getting over 200 a day some days, it's awful. But then people who were fighting were saying that the Muslim Brotherhood groups were getting better weapons because they were being prepared for what's coming next. So the people that were supplying the weapons obviously were doing it with a view to who they wanted to see rise up in the end.
But since when has a Saudi-backed situation or solution to this situation become like a credible alternative? Because it's like 6 of one and half a dozen of the other when it comes to like differing dictatorships out the Middle East. It's just funny to me how one situation is like a secular dictator and the other one is having their arms provided by a religious fundamentalist dictator in Saudi Arabia. It's just a bit weird.
Yes, the Saudis don't want democracy in Syria anyway. Last thing they want.
Yeah, I think
it's a bit too close to home.
Sorry.
Were you done? Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking to say, like, if you want to have a revolution, and I think whether you're Christian or Muslim, religious or not, you take whatever aid you can get, whoever it is from, I think.
Yeah.
And then once you got the country, you start doing your own decisions.
Yeah.
Although I don't think any of these aids come without conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
There's always.
That's another problem later on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another thing with refugees. You know, with the whole refugee issue as well. Like with the humanitarian aid, where is that aid going? Is it really going to the refugees, or is it going somewhere else? You know, is it really helping these people or not?
And what's happened in some areas is the aid's gone to the mosques. And if you go to the mosque, you get it, and if you don't get the mosque, you don't. So, you know, and then the mosques are seen as being the providers, so come and join ours and they become stronger. It is all linked to politics and religion. It's not about me.
Does anyone have any more questions or anything?
Can I just do an advert? If you're interested in what's happening, I do a daily blog on Syria. Supportkurds.org is the web address. So if you're ever interested, and I collect information from different websites and from the media as well. So
What was that, sorry?
Supportkurds.org.
Well, I guess that's it, guys. Thanks very much for coming. It was really nice to see quite a lot of you here. Thanks for all your questions.